All right, welcome back to Unit 6. This is video 1. And today we're going to be going through the civilizations in Africa and India. So let's get started. So the historical books of the Bible center on the nations of Israel, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But at the same time that these civilizations were flourishing, there was other equally splendid civilizations that were developing in Africa, India, and China. And in the centuries that followed, the ministry of the apostles, the gospel, following the ministry of the apostles, the gospel also spread to these parts of the world. And there really is little evidence that Christianity thrived initially in these regions. However, recently, Christianity has begun to grow in Africa and Asia more quickly than in really many of the other regions of the globe. So it is important to understand the history of these cultures um, as as believers. So let's start with Africa. So it is the second largest continent. Africa covers over one-fifth of the Earth's land surface, and it's nearly 4 times the size of the continental United States. And much of the continent is a large plateau. So it has mountains, but it's mainly desert, grassy, flat lands. And then in parts of Africa, there is unique, beautiful jungles. So we have studied some of Africa's history in our earlier units. And we know that the Egyptians established the banks of the Nile, and that's the earliest recorded civilization in Africa. We know about Carthage, and it was built, how it built a thriving civilization in North Africa during the Roman Empire days. And so we're going to be looking at more of the sub-Saharan Africa history. Because before we were primarily looking at Northern Africa, now we're moving down south, Sub-Saharan Africa. This is where the Sahara Desert is and things like that. So while secular historians assume that mankind and his predecessors inhabited Africa for many thousands of years or more, the first trace of people in Africa actually may be found in what anthropologists refer to as the Bantu migration. The people who took part in this migration are known by little more than a family of languages that became known as the Bantu languages. So, given the speculative nature of this information, it should not be surprising that scholars vary on how many African languages fit under the Bantu heading and everything like that. It varies. Some would say, like, but roughly, it's 300 to 600 languages. So there's many theories about the origin of the migration, and some say it goes back all the way to 3000 BC. If this time frame is correct, it would roughly correspond actually with the dispersion of people at the Tower of Babel and might tie the migration of people to Africa in the biblical account in Genesis 11. However, if this migration was more recent, then it would have affected people living in Central and Southern Africa at the same time. Possible changes could have included intermarriage, conquests, where the immigrants found resistance and pressure on original residents to move to unpopulated regions. We don't have any history of like clashes between different people groups with one coming in if it was more recent. So more anthropologists lean towards um, the later date, 3000 BC, and what we know about the Bible, that means it probably coincides with Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel. So there's two important kingdoms that came out of the Bantu migration era that you need to know about, the Kush and the Aksum. So, centuries before Europeans came into sub-Saharan Africa, several African civilizations flourished. In ancient times, two important kingdoms arose in the northeast Africa, south of the Egyptian civilization. The earliest one was Kush, in what is today northern Sudan. And in fact, ruins of the capital still exist there today. So this is in like North Sudan area, the Kingdom of Kush. So for nearly 2,000 years, Kush served as a province of Egypt. The Egyptians valued the gold, granite, slaves, and other resources that were abundant in Kush and passed through their region in trade. So to maintain and protect this commerce, the Egyptians constructed and occupied several forts along the Nile River, which served as a focal point that united Egypt and parts of the Eastern Africa. Over time, Egypt's power declined and it could no longer dominate this region. So by 1000 BC, Kush had won its independence from a very weakened Egypt and began to seize territory previously controlled by the pharaohs. Kush continued to grow until 700 BC, when it had not only overthrown Egyptian rule, but also conquered all of Egypt and established its own dynasty of pharaohs. We even see one of these Kush pharaohs mentioned in 2 Kings 19:9, um, Tirahaka of Ethiopia. It's a brief mention in the Bible. So Kushite control in Egypt was brief, though, and eventually the invading Assyrians would drive the Kushites out of Egypt. But the Kushite kingdom continued for nearly another 1,000 years after they were kicked out of Egypt. So, that is a mistake on the PowerPoint. It says the kingdom lasted for about 1,000 years. I meant to put the kingdom continued for nearly another 1,000 years after they got kicked out of Egypt by the Assyrians. Okay, so Axum Kingdom. So Cush eventually fell to a kingdom to its south that was known as Axum. And the ruler of Axum recorded the shattering defeat he inflicted on the Cushites in AD 330. So um, this is from a primary document of what he wrote about it. So I'm going to read just part of it to you. So listen closely to the actual account. I made war on them. They fled without making a stand, and I pursued them, killing some and capturing others. I burnt their towns, both those built of bricks and those built of reeds, and my army carried off their food and copper and iron and destroyed the statues in their temples, their granaries and cotton trees, and cast them into the Nile. Woo! So true decimation. So Axum was unusual among the early African kingdoms in that it embraced a form of Christianity. Later tradition claimed that the rulers of Axum were descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. However, the kingdom's conversion to Christianity was actually believed to be the work of a Syrian Christian named Frumentius. You do need to know Frumentius's name. He's important. Axum's conversion intensified its already extensive trade with the Roman Empire. Later Muslim invasions of North Africa would cut off the Axums from all other European contact. But the civilization nonetheless continued to exist, and it would become the nucleus of the modern state of Ethiopia. So Kush was in Sudan, Axum is in Ethiopia. So let me tell you a little bit more about Frumentius. So the conversion of Axum. Now, I will also say something you need to know is that in some history books, the Axum kingdom is called the Abyssinia kingdom. I'm sorry, Abyssinia, Abyssinia. So just know that if you ever see Abyssinia, they are talking about Axum. So the conversion of Axum is believed to be the result of the ministry of an unlikely missionary named Frumentius. We have really little information about his early years. We know that he was a professing Christian and a Roman citizen, and he was probably from the city of Tyre, and he was probably born around AD 300. So while he's still a young man, he and his brother were traveling abroad with a relative, and pirates came and attacked their ship and massacred most of the crew and passengers. And the pirates separated the brothers. Excuse me. Ooh, big yawn. So the pirates separated the brothers, but then actually spared them both from death. But they did sell them into slavery, and they separated them. So Frumentius and his brother, like Joseph in Egypt, um, rose to high positions in government because of their abilities. So we're going to focus on Frumentius here. We don't really know much about his brother. So as treasurer and secretary to the king of Axum, Frumentius earned the trust of high officials in government. And when the king died, the queen asked Frumentius to help administer the government until the young prince was old enough to rule on his own. So while serving the kingdom, Frumentius also promoted his Christian faith. He encouraged Christian merchants from the Roman Empire to hold private services during their visits at Axum. And under Frumentius's preaching and guidance, the citizens of Axum also began to convert to Christianity. And then the young prince whom Frumentius served was probably Ezana, the king who won the great victory over Cush in 330. Ezana seemed to have accepted Christianity later in life. Historians note that he did not credit his victory over Cush to pagan gods, as he had done with victories earlier on in his reign, but by the might of the Lord of heaven, who in heaven and upon earth is mightier than everything which exists. He also praised the Lord of heaven, who to all eternity reigns the perfect one. Ezana's conversion was perhaps the crowning work of Frumentius, a man since remembered as the apostle to the Abyssinians. So, you never know what the Lord has in store for you. You never know how he's going to turn the rough, negative, not ideal aspects of your life into trophies of his grace and glory. So, Frumentius, I want you to know that name and that he helped the Axum kingdom and specifically the young prince Ezana. All right. Just one last thing about Axum. Just a little cultural achievement thing. Axum demonstrated significant accomplishments in their culture. They possessed the only known written language in this period of African history, and the kingdom also minted coins from bronze, silver, and gold to serve as an actual like coinage currency. Um, so they were highly advanced. They actually had a lot of agricultural advances too, including terraced farming, and they used technology to transform hilly regions into capable soil. They figured out how to irrigate and have a steady source of water, and they used reservoirs, and channels to collect water. Um, but perhaps the most enduring achievement was the development of commemorative stone pillars or steles, Steles, so steles. The Axum stele was constructed from stone cut miles from the eventual site and carved with images bearing vaults, doors, wooden beams, and windows. And rather than bond the stones with mortar, craftsmen designed the stones to fit together once they assembled. And so the tallest of these structures was probably about 100 feet tall, and the tallest surviving one is 60 feet tall. So steles are a lot of monuments today, and the idea of monuments are based off of the steles of the Axum kingdom. All right, to India now. If you remember way back in chapter 2, we examined the early cultures and features of Indian society. And we also looked at the influence of Hinduism and Buddhism on Indian culture. So in this particular unit, we are going to study the political, cultural, and religious elements of India between 500 BC and AD 500. So, while many aspects of Indian society have pretty much remained the same from what you saw in our Unit 2 to now, Unit 6, the political history of India has been one of the most frequent to change. And through much of its history, India has been a little more than a patchwork of small rival kingdoms, with successive waves of foreign invaders streaming into the Indian subcontinent. So the powerful empires established by these invaders provided brief periods of unity and stability, but in 326 BC, Alexander the Great threatened India. His armies crossed the Indus River and conquered many small kingdoms in India's northwest region. And Alexander intended to advance further into India, but it was only when his army refused to continue to march that he backed down. And according to traditional accounts, when he was in India, he met a young man named Chandragupta Maurya. And as Alexander's empire began to disintegrate after his death, Chandragupta conquered the disorganized and weak kingdoms in the north and created the first strong empire of India, the Mauryan Empire. So the most famous of the Mauryan rulers was Chandragupta's grandson, uh, Asoka, and he extended the Mauryan Empire to include all but the southern tip of India. But then, after he had conquered the whole subcontinent, he was kind of sickened by the results of his own bloody conquests. Asoka renounced war and converted to Buddhism, and he spent much of his reign promoting the Buddhist religion. Asoka is credited with building thousands of Buddhist shrines called stupas. So remember, we had stelas with Africa, and now we have stupas here. Stupas are Buddhist shrines. He also had Buddhist teachings inscribed on stone pillars throughout the empire. And many of these stone pillars are actually still there. So they do provide a lot of information concerning Asoka's reign. Their primary document from that time. Primary artifact is what we would call that. One of his most far-reaching acts was sending of Buddhist missionaries abroad. Buddhism soon spread across much of Southeast Asia, where it became a powerful force in other Asian cultures, even though it did not gain a wide following in India itself. Hindu priests viewed Buddhist teachings as dangerous to the caste system, and they feared that they might lose their prestige and rank in society if they in society. So they worked against the acceptance of Buddhist beliefs. Now we're going to move on to the next great empire, the Gupta Empire. So the first great period of Indian unity was pretty short-lived, and not long after Asoka's death in 232 BC, the Mauryan Empire collapsed. And the years between the second century BC and the third century AD witnessed multiple invasions, um, lots of small competing kingdoms all fighting over the same land. So it was a time of turmoil. And India did not enjoy a profitable trade with Rome and China. So it's not until the fourth century AD that we see the rise of the Gupta Empire, that India now enters the global stage as a strong force under the Gupta Empire. And this is probably its greatest era of prosperity and achievement, um, is during this particular time in the 4th century AD. One historian has stated that at the time, India was perhaps the happiest and most civilized region of the world, was during the Gupta dynasty. So the Gupta dynasty reunited northern India under a strong and effective government. They had trade routes that connected India from Southeast Asia and China to the east and Persia, and the Silk Road also developed during this period and enabled merchants to carry on trade from China to Rome. So India's culture spread throughout Southeast Asia. India's universities attracted students from all over the continent, and its people made great strides in the fields of textile and ironwork. So the Gupta Age was one of the finest periods of Indian art, architecture, literature, and science. Now, Gupta literature became renowned for its adventurous and imaginary fables and fairy tales. And there's a really famous Indian poet that you should probably know a little bit about, a dramatist at the time, and his name was Kalidasa. So Kalidasa, Kalidasa. And he was probably one of the most famous authors at the time. Um, some people even say that Kalidasa was the Indian Shakespeare. So the popularity of these stories touched on universal themes and just like English Shakespeare does. And so the stories soon spread outside of India. Many of them found their way in literature in other lands. They also had many advances in math, science, and medicine. So our so-called Arabic numerals originally came from India. Indian Indian mathematicians were among the first to use negative numbers, the decimal, and zero. And centuries before Isaac Newton, Indian scientists developed their own theories of gravity. And Indian astronomers knew that the Earth was round and that it rotated on its axis. And if you were in need of medical attention, the people of the Gupta Empire went to free hospitals where Indian physicians performed many surgical procedures. So during the 6th century, the Gupta Empire collapsed under the repeated attack of the so-called White Huns. These are probably a group that were related to the Huns that plagued the Roman Empire. And after they're attacked by the Huns, India again is going to enter a period of political disorder. And the country's yet again going to become divided and into small warring kingdoms. And we're going to see a wave of foreign invaders again. But um, but as in the past, Hinduism absorbed the culture of these foreign elements into Indian society. So the history of India took a dramatic turn when northern India fell under the domination of the Muslims, who would bring with them ideology as all-encompassing as Hinduism. Let me see if there's anything else I need you to know here. Oops, sorry. I think I'll just briefly talk about the decline in Buddhism that we see, and then also a little bit about the spread of the gospel in India. So during the Mauryan dynasty, Buddhism split into two philosophical schools. Now, this is just a little bit of extra just to kind of let you know what's happening. But you don't need to know this religion aspect for our test in 2025. All right. So this is for the 2025 class, but I do want this in the video. So we see Buddhism split into two philosophical schools. The Theravada Buddhists continued to hold the original teachings of Buddha and emphasized his humanity. And then the Mahayana Buddhists transformed Buddha into a supernatural being. And they also gained support among the common people by teaching that anyone could become enlightened. Buddhism grew under Asaka and enjoyed royal support. During the Gupta Empire, actually, though, Buddhism lost its royal support, but it was sustained by the merchant class. And so during this period, worship of the images of Buddha became common. So, despite commercial support, Buddhism declined during the Gupta Empire as the rulers tended to support Hinduism. And in addition to that, Hinduism experienced a revival during this period by reinventing its teachings. Hindu priests adopted some of the Buddhist ideas and made Hinduism more attractive to the Indian people and eroded popular support for Buddhism. And then Hinduism de emphasized the thousands of Hindu gods and offered a simplified version that centered on Brahma, creator of the world, and Vishnu, the preserver of the world, and Shiva, the destroyer of the world. So the reformation of Hinduism into a more personal religion and simplified religion resulted in a greater popular appeal in India. And as a result, Buddhism ceased to be a significant religion in India. Now, when it comes to the spread of the gospel in India, according to tradition, the Apostle Thomas brought the gospel to India. Remember Doubting Thomas? That's who we're talking about. Whether this tradition is accurate or not, travel between the Roman Empire and India was common in the first century, and it is likely that early in the church's history, Christians did bring the gospel to India. The church historian Eusebius recorded that a man named Pantanius traveled as a missionary to India. And when he arrived, he found Christians there already, and they had copies of the Gospel of Matthew. And so by the fourth century, Christians in Persia had made contact with the Christians in India. And the Indians sent their leaders to schools in Persia for training until the Muslims conquered Persia. And the scattered communities of Indian Christians were never very large, but they were still in existence when the Portuguese landed in India in the 15th century to open trade between India and Europe. So it is most likely that Thomas and other missionaries did spread the gospel in India well before the majority of people even knew about India. All right, that is where we're going to stop today. I hope you guys have a great day. I will see you later.